The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the basement archives of Duke University's Perkins Library, casting harsh shadows across rows of filing cabinets that stretched into the darkness. Dr. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her reading glasses and pulled another dusty box from the shelf, her back aching from hours of cataloguing the Whitmore Aviation Collection, a recently donated treasure trove of early flight memorabilia. It was nearly midnight on a humid September evening in Durham, North Carolina, and Sarah should have gone home hours ago. But something about this particular donation had captured her attention. The collection belonged to Harold Whitmore, a reclusive aviation enthusiast who had died without family, leaving behind decades of carefully preserved photographs, documents, and artifacts from aviation's golden age. Sarah opened the box labeled pre-1910 photographs and immediately felt her pulse quicken. Inside were dozens of original glass plate negatives and albumen prints from the earliest days of powered flight. Her trained eye recognized several historically significant images: early experiments at Huffman Prairie, Glenn Curtis's flying exhibitions, and what appeared to be previously unknown photographs from the Wright Brothers experiments. She lifted out a manila envelope marked Kitty Hawk, December 1903, Original Negatives. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a glass plate negative and 3 original prints of what was clearly the famous photograph of the Wright brothers standing beside their flyer after their historic first flight. But as Sarah examined the prints under her magnifying glass, something made her blood run cold. In the center photograph there was Orville Wright, standing proudly next to his revolutionary machine. But on his left wrist was something that shouldn't exist, something impossible. A sleek, modern digital device wrapped around his wrist, its screen clearly displaying numbers that glowed with an otherworldly light. Sarah squinted harder, adjusting her desk lamp. The display showed what appeared to be a date, 7/17/1996, and below it, in smaller text that made her skin crawl, TWA Flight 800, 230 souls. Sarah's chair scraped against the concrete floor as she pushed back from the table, her heart hammering against her ribs. She blinked hard, certain she was seeing things after too many hours in the dim archive. But when she looked again, the impossible device was still there, as clear as day in the 120-year-old photograph. She grabbed her phone and activated the flashlight, holding it at different angles to examine the print. There was no sign of tampering, no evidence of digital manipulation or photographic trickery. The grain structure was consistent throughout, the aging patterns natural. Every test she could think of suggested this was an authentic 1903 photograph, but that was impossible. Digital wristbands didn't exist in 1903. Hell, digital anything didn't exist in 1903. And TWA Flight 800, Sarah's blood turned to ice as she remembered that disaster. The Boeing 747 that exploded over Long Island in 1996, killing all 230 people aboard. The exact number displayed on the impossible device. With shaking hands, she picked up the other 2 prints from the envelope. The first showed the same scene from a slightly different angle, and there it was again, the anachronistic wristband glowing on Orville's wrist. But the second print made her stomach lurch. This one showed Wilbur Wright, and on his wrist was a similar device, but the display was different. 09/11/2001, and beneath it, United 175, American 11, 2,977 souls. Sarah's hands were shaking so violently now that she nearly dropped the photograph. September 11th, 2001. The date burned into every American's memory, the day that changed everything. And 2,977, the total death count from the terrorist attacks. She stumbled backward, knocking over her coffee cup, the cold liquid spreading across the table and seeping into historical documents she no longer cared about. Her rational mind screamed that this had to be an elaborate hoax, but her expert eye couldn't find a single flaw in the photographs. They were genuine 1903 prints, she was certain of it. The archive suddenly felt suffocating, the shadows deeper and more menacing. Sarah grabbed her phone with trembling fingers and speed-dialed her colleague at the Smithsonian, Dr. James Rodriguez, a forensic photography expert who had helped her authenticate questionable documents before. The phone rang 4 times before his groggy voice answered. "Sarah, do you know what time it is? Jim, I need you to come to Durham tonight. I've found something that's going to change everything we know about early aviation photography." There was a long pause. "Sarah, you're scaring me. What's wrong?" She looked down at the impossible photograph spread across the table. the digital displays seeming to pulse with their own malevolent light. "I've found proof that someone has been manipulating historical events for over a century, and Jim, I think they're still out there." The fluorescent light above her flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the archive into darkness. In the sudden blackness, Sarah could swear she heard the distant sound of aircraft engines, growing closer and closer, though she knew that was impossible. The basement had no windows, and the nearest airport was miles away, but the sound grew louder, more insistent until it seemed to fill the entire room, and then, cutting through the mechanical drone, came something far worse, the unmistakable sound of screaming passengers, as if echoing across time from disasters yet to come. Dr. James Rodriguez arrived at Duke University at 3 in the morning, his hair disheveled, and his usually immaculate appearance replaced by hastily thrown-on jeans and a wrinkled T-shirt. Sarah met him at the archive entrance, her face pale and drawn in the harsh security lighting of the corridor. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Jim said, studying her haggard expression as she led him through the maze of basement hallways. "Maybe I have," Sarah replied quietly, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Jim, in 30 years of studying historical photography, I've never encountered anything like this. I need you to tell me I'm losing my mind." They entered the archive room where Sarah had left everything exactly as it was when the lights went out hours earlier. She had spent the intervening time pacing the corridors above, unable to bring herself to return to the basement alone. Now, with the fluorescent lights humming normally overhead, the photographs looked almost innocent, spread across the research table. Jim approached the prints with the careful precision of a forensic scientist. He pulled on latex gloves and adjusted his own magnifying equipment, a high-powered loupe he'd used to authenticate everything from Civil War photographs to suspected Nazi forgeries. "Walk me through what you found," he said, leaning over the first print. Sarah pointed to Orville Wright's wrist. "There, do you see it?" Jim studied the image for several long minutes, his expression growing increasingly puzzled. He moved his loupe across every inch of the photograph, examining grain patterns, shadow consistency, and aging characteristics. "The paper stock is definitely period correct," he muttered. "Albumin print on original mounting board. The chemical composition of the emulsion matches what I'd expect from 1903. He looked up at Sarah, confusion creasing his brow. "But this device—" "Keep looking," Sarah said grimly. Jim examined the second print, then the third. With each image, his frown deepened. He pulled out a small UV light and scanned the photographs under different spectrums. Then he produced a digital microscope, connecting it to his laptop to examine the prints at extreme magnification. "The grain structure is completely consistent," he said, his voice growing quieter. "There's no evidence of digital manipulation, no layering, no inconsistencies in the silver halide crystals. These are genuine period photographs." "But that's impossible," Sarah said. "I know." Jim straightened up and ran his hands through his hair. "The devices on their wrists show technology that wouldn't exist for another century, but every forensic test I can run says these are authentic 1903 prints." Sarah showed him the dates and text on the devices. Jim's face went ashen as he processed the implications. "TWA Flight 800, he whispered, and 9/11. These are disasters that happened decades after these photographs were supposedly taken." "There's something else," Sarah said. She opened her laptop and pulled up a database of historical aviation photographs. "I've been thinking about this all night. If these anomalies exist in the Wright Brothers photos, what about other significant moments in aviation history?" She had already begun cross-referencing major aviation disasters with known photographs from earlier periods. Her search had yielded disturbing results. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a 1927 photograph of Charles Lindbergh standing beside the Spirit of St. Louis. "I found this in the Library of Congress digital archives just 2 hours ago." Jim leaned in to examine the image on the screen. There, barely visible on Lindbergh's jacket, was what appeared to be a small pin or badge. But when enhanced, it showed a miniature digital display reading 05/06/1937, Hindenburg, 36 souls. "The Hindenburg disaster," Jim breathed. 10 years before it happened. Sarah clicked to another image. Amelia Earhart, 1935, posing with her Lockheed Electra. She zoomed in on Earhart's flight suit. Stitched into the fabric, almost invisible to the naked eye, was text that read 07/2/1937, disappeared, Pacific. Her own disappearance date, Jim said, sinking into a chair, 2 years before it happened. They spent the next hour examining dozens of historical aviation photographs, finding similar anomalies in images spanning nearly a century. Each one showed advanced knowledge of future disasters, always accurate to the date and casualty count. "This isn't random," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone or something has been documenting aviation disasters before they happen. But why? And how?" Jim was studying the original Wright Brothers prints again under his microscope. "Sarah, look at this. The devices aren't just showing dates and casualty figures. There's something else here." He adjusted the focus and pointed to a section of Orville's wristband. "There's additional text, so small it's barely visible. It says Kronos Project Phase 1. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Phase 1, that implies there are other phases." "And on Wilbur's device," Jim continued, "it says temporal anchor established, aviation timeline compromised." The room fell silent except for the humming of the fluorescent lights. Both researchers stared at the impossible photographs, trying to process what they had discovered. "We need to contact the FBI," Jim said finally. "This could be evidence of some kind of terrorist organization with advanced knowledge of disasters. Or what?" Sarah asked. Jim looked at her with haunted eyes. "Or we're dealing with something far worse than terrorism, something that operates outside the normal flow of time itself." As if summoned by his words, the lights flickered again. But this time, in the brief moment of darkness, both researchers could swear they saw additional figures standing in the shadows of the archive, figures wearing the same impossible devices, their digital displays pulsing with dates yet to come. When the light steadied, the figures were gone, but on the table next to the Wright brothers' photographs lay a new image that hadn't been there moments before. It was a photograph of Sarah and Jim, standing in the very archive where they now sat. The timestamp on Sarah's wrist read 09/28/2023, Kronos Phase 2, witnesses acquired, tomorrow's date. Sarah and Jim stared at the impossible photograph of themselves, their faces frozen in terror. The image was crisp and clear, showing them exactly as they appeared at that very moment, down to the coffee stain on Sarah's blouse and the stubble on Jim's unshaven jaw. "This is impossible," Jim whispered, picking up the photograph with trembling hands. "This wasn't here 30 seconds ago." Sarah examined the image more closely. The quality was identical to the historical prints, the same paper stock, the same chemical processes. But this photograph showed them in present-day clothing, in the modern archive room with contemporary equipment visible in the background. "Look at the timestamp again," she said, her voice barely audible. "September 28th, 2023. That's tomorrow. And it says, witnesses acquired." Jim set the photograph down carefully, as if it might explode. "We need to get out of here right now." But as they turned toward the exit, they found their path blocked by a tall figure in an old-fashioned suit. The man appeared to be in his 70s, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold decades of terrible knowledge. Most unsettling was the device on his wrist, identical to those in the Wright brothers' photographs, but this one was real, solid, pulsing with an otherworldly blue light. "Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Rodriguez," the man said in a cultured voice tinged with what sounded like a faint German accent. "My name is Dr. Heinrich Voss. I believe we need to talk." Sarah's hand instinctively moved toward her phone, but Voss shook his head. "Please don't. I'm not here to harm you, quite the opposite. I'm here to warn you about what you've stumbled into." "Who are you?" Jim demanded, positioning himself protectively in front of Sarah. "I was a physicist once upon a time, MIT, class of 1962. I specialized in temporal mechanics, theoretical work that most of my colleagues dismissed as science fiction." Voss gestured to the photographs spread across the table. "Until I made it real." He moved closer to the research table, his eyes scanning the Wright brothers' prints with obvious familiarity. "I see you found the early samples, the proof of concept, you might say." "You did this?" Sarah asked, horror creeping into her voice. "You've been manipulating historical photographs." "Not manipulating," Voss corrected. "Documenting, recording the inevitable." He touched his wristband, and the display changed to show a complex timeline with branching possibilities. "In 1969, I discovered that time is not linear as we assumed. It's more like a river with eddies and currents, places where the flow can be disrupted or redirected. Aviation disasters, I learned, create particularly strong temporal signatures." "Why?" Jim asked, despite himself becoming fascinated by the explanation. "The moment of a plane crash generates enormous emotional energy, hundreds of people experiencing terror simultaneously. That collective psychic trauma tears holes in the fabric of time itself. Through those holes, information can travel backward. Sarah felt sick. So you've been using plane crashes to send information back in time? Not causing them, Voss said quickly. They would happen anyway. I'm merely harvesting the temporal energy they create. The devices you see in the photographs are receivers, not transmitters. They display information sent back from the moment of disaster. He showed them his wristband again. The display now read, Project Kronos, Phase 3 initiated, final convergence imminent. What's Phase 3? Sarah demanded. Voss's expression grew grave. For 50 years, I've been documenting aviation disasters, studying the patterns, learning how temporal energy flows around moments of mass tragedy. But documentation was never the end goal. It was preparation. He walked to the far wall of the archive, where Sarah noticed for the first time that several boxes had been moved, revealing a hidden alcove. Inside was sophisticated electronic equipment that definitely hadn't been there when she arrived that evening. Tomorrow, September 28th at 3:47 p.m. Eastern Time, American Airlines Flight 1247 will depart Charlotte Douglas International Airport bound for Seattle. The Boeing 777 will be carrying 312 passengers and crew. Sarah's blood ran cold. Will be? You mean, it's going to crash, Voss confirmed. But this won't be an accident. This will be the culmination of my life's work. The temporal energy generated by 312 deaths simultaneously will be more than enough to tear a permanent rift in time. You're going to murder 312 people, Jim shouted, lunging toward Voss, but the older man raised his wristband, and Jim suddenly froze mid-step, as if caught in amber. Only his eyes could move, wide with terror and rage. I'm not a monster, Voss said sadly. I'm a scientist trying to save our species. Through that permanent rift, I'll be able to send critical information back through time, warnings about climate change, pandemic protocols, technological advances. Humanity could avoid its greatest mistakes. By committing mass murder, Sarah spat, by sacrificing a few to save millions. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Sarah noticed that her phone was still in her pocket. If she could somehow contact authorities, warn them about Flight 1247. You're thinking about calling someone, Voss said, observing her closely. It won't work. I've been preparing for this moment for decades. The flight manifest has already been altered to ensure maximum temporal impact. The passengers were specifically selected, people whose deaths will create the strongest psychic resonance. You're insane, Sarah whispered. Am I? Look around you, Dr. Mitchell. Climate change accelerating, political systems failing, another pandemic inevitable. Humanity is on a collision course with extinction. My work offers the only hope of changing course. He gestured to Jim's frozen form. Your colleague will remain in temporal stasis until after the event, but you have a choice. Join me and help me use the rift to send back information that could save our world, or try to stop me and watch helplessly as both your friend and the passengers of Flight 1247 die. The wristband on Voss's arm began pulsing more rapidly, and the display changed to show a countdown. T-14:23:17 to final convergence. 14 hours, Voss said. That's how long you have to decide whether you're going to help me save humanity or condemn it to repeat its mistakes forever. He walked toward the exit, then paused. Oh, and Dr. Mitchell? That photograph of you and Dr. Rodriguez, it's not a prediction, it's a guarantee. By tomorrow evening, you'll both be part of Project Kronos, whether you choose to be or not. As Voss disappeared into the shadows of the corridor, the temporal field around Jim suddenly collapsed, and he crashed to the floor, gasping for air. Sarah, he wheezed, struggling to stand. We have to stop him. But even as she helped her colleague to his feet, Sarah couldn't shake the terrible certainty that they were already too late. Somewhere in the darkness above them, a countdown was ticking toward an unthinkable tragedy, and she had less than 14 hours to prevent the deaths of 312 innocent people. Sarah and Jim burst out of the archive building into the pre-dawn darkness of Durham, their breath visible in the cool September air. The campus was eerily quiet, with only the distant hum of traffic on nearby highways breaking the silence. We need to contact the FBI, the FAA, anyone who will listen, Jim said, pulling out his phone with shaking hands. And tell them what? Sarah asked, though she was already dialing 911. That a time-traveling physicist is going to crash a plane using temporal energy. The emergency operator answered on the second ring. 911, what's your emergency? This is Dr. Sarah Mitchell at Duke University. I need to report a credible threat against American Airlines Flight 1247, scheduled to depart Charlotte tomorrow afternoon. Ma'am, I'm going to transfer you to our terrorism hotline. Please hold. As Sarah waited, Jim was frantically searching his phone for information about the flight. Flight 1247, Charlotte to Seattle. Departure time 3:47 p.m. It exists, Sarah. It's real. The terrorism hotline picked up after what felt like an eternity. Sarah quickly explained the situation to Agent Rebecca Torres, trying to sound as credible as possible, while omitting the more unbelievable details about time travel. Dr. Mitchell, you're saying you have advanced knowledge of a planned attack on this specific flight? Yes. The perpetrator is Dr. Heinrich Voss, a former MIT physicist. He has sophisticated equipment and detailed knowledge of the flight manifest. We'll investigate immediately. Can you provide us with any physical evidence? Sarah looked back at the archive building, thinking of the impossible photographs still spread across the research table. Yes, but you're not going to believe it. We'll be the judge of that. Stay where you are. Agents will be there within the hour to collect evidence and take your statement. After hanging up, Sarah and Jim paced anxiously outside the building. The weight of 312 lives rested on their shoulders, and they had no idea if anyone would take their story seriously. We should try to find out more about Voss, Jim suggested. If he really was at MIT in the 1960s, there should be records. They returned to the archive, avoiding the room where they'd made their terrifying discovery. Instead, they went to Sarah's office on the 3rd floor, where she had access to academic databases and historical records. Heinrich Voss, MIT, graduated 1962, Sarah typed into the university alumni database. After a few moments, a file appeared on the screen. There he is, Jim said, leaning over her shoulder. Heinrich Voss, Ph.D. in Theoretical Physics, 1962. Dissertation, titled Temporal Mechanics and Causality Paradoxes. Graduated summa cum laude. Sarah scrolled through the file. Look at this. After graduation, he joined a classified government project called Project Looking Glass. The file's mostly redacted, but it mentions research into temporal displacement technologies for military applications. The government was researching time travel in the 1960s, Jim asked incredulously. Apparently, but look here. In 1969, the project was suddenly terminated and Voss disappeared. He was presumed dead after a laboratory accident at a facility in Nevada. But he's obviously not dead, Jim pointed out. Sarah continued reading. Wait, there's more. The accident report mentions a catastrophic temporal displacement event that resulted in the complete destruction of the laboratory and the disappearance of all personnel. The site was classified and sealed. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she realized the implications. Jim, what if the accident didn't kill him? What if it displaced him in time? What if he's been jumping through different time periods for the past 50 years, studying aviation disasters and preparing for this? Moment. Before Jim could respond, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed Agent Torres from the FBI. Dr. Mitchell, we've run a preliminary check on Heinrich Voss. According to our records, he died in 1969. Are you certain that's the name the man gave you? I'm certain, Sarah said, but I think we need to discuss the possibility that your records might be incomplete. We're sending a team to Duke immediately. Don't touch anything in the archive until we arrive. After the call ended, Sarah and Jim sat in tense silence, watching the clock on her computer screen tick toward dawn. With each passing minute, they were getting closer to the moment when Flight 1247 would taxi down the runway in Charlotte. Even if the FBI takes this seriously, how can they stop something that involves time travel? Jim asked. I don't know, Sarah admitted, but we have to try. She turned back to the computer and began searching for any other information about Project Looking Glass or temporal displacement research. What she found made her blood run cold. Jim, look at this. I found a declassified CIA document from 1970. It's a memo about anomalous temporal incidents. Following the Nevada facility accident, they documented dozens of unexplained appearances of individuals claiming to be from different time periods. You mean there were others like Voss? Not like Voss. The document suggests these were all the same person, Heinrich Voss, appearing at different points in time throughout the 1970s. Each appearance was associated with aviation disasters that occurred shortly afterward. Jim studied the document over her shoulder. So he's been doing this for 50 years, learning, preparing, perfecting his technique. And now he's ready for his grand finale, Sarah said grimly. The sound of vehicles pulling up outside caught their attention. Through the office window, they could see a convoy of black SUVs surrounding the building, and federal agents in tactical gear securing the perimeter. "The FBI's here," Jim observed. "Think they'll believe us?" Sarah gathered the documents they'd found and prepared to meet with the agents. They'd better. Because if they don't, 312 people are going to die in less than 12 hours, and Voss is going to tear a permanent hole in time itself. As they headed downstairs to meet the federal agents, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. Voss had been too confident, too prepared. He'd had 50 years to plan this moment, and she doubted he'd left anything to chance. The real question was, even if they managed to convince the authorities to take the threat seriously, would it be enough to stop a man who could manipulate time itself? In her pocket, her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Dr. Mitchell, you have 11 hours and 23 minutes to make your choice. Choose wisely. The future of humanity depends on it. HV." Sarah showed the message to Jim just as the first FBI agents entered the building. Whatever happened next, she realized, would determine not just the fate of Flight 1247, but potentially the entire timeline of human history. Agent Rebecca Torres was a woman in her 40s with steel-gray eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had seen every kind of threat imaginable. She studied Sarah and Jim across the conference table in Duke's administration building, flanked by 2 other agents and a man in a dark suit who had introduced himself only as Director Walsh from a specialized division. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Agent Torres said, reviewing her notes. "You're claiming that a man who officially died in 1969 appeared to you last night and threatened to crash a commercial airliner using time travel technology?" "I know how it sounds," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "But I have physical evidence. The photographs I showed your technical team are currently being analyzed by our forensics lab," Director Walsh interrupted. His voice carried an authority that suggested he outranked everyone else in the room. "Dr. Mitchell, I need you to understand something. The photographs you've provided show anomalies that our experts cannot currently explain." Agent Torres looked surprised at this admission, but Walsh continued without acknowledging her reaction. "More concerning is that we've found references to Heinrich Voss in classified files dating back to the 1960s, files that were sealed under national security protocols." "So you believe us?" Jim asked hopefully. "I believe that something extraordinary is happening," Walsh said carefully. "Whether it's time travel or an elaborate hoax using technology we don't understand, we're taking the threat seriously. Flight 1247 has been indefinitely grounded pending investigation." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Thank God. At least the passengers are safe." "For now," Walsh agreed. "But Dr. Mitchell, if this Heinrich Voss is real, and if he possesses the capabilities you've described, grounding one flight may not be enough. He could simply target another aircraft." Sarah's phone buzzed with another text message. She looked at it, and her face went pale. "What is it?" Agent Torres asked. Sarah held up her phone so everyone could see the message. "Flight grounded, impressive. But there are hundreds of flights every day, Dr. Mitchell. I only need one. You have 10 hours to find me." HV. Director Walsh immediately got on his radio. "This is Walsh. I need a complete ground stop of all commercial aviation in the southeastern United States, effective immediately. Authorization code Omega 77. "Sir, that's going to affect thousands of flights," came the response. "Do it now and get me a direct line to FAA Administrator Chen." As Walsh coordinated the massive disruption of air traffic, Sarah found herself staring at the impossible photographs spread across the table. Something about them was bothering her, some detail she felt she was missing. "Agent Torres," she said slowly, "you mentioned that these are being analyzed by your forensics team. Have they found anything else unusual about them?" "Actually, yes. There's something we didn't mention earlier." Torres pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah an enhanced version of one of the Wright Brothers photographs. "Our lab discovered that the devices in the images aren't just displaying dates and casualty figures. There's additional data encoded in what appears to be a barcode along the bottom edge of each display." Sarah squinted at the enhanced image. The barcode was almost invisible, requiring extreme magnification to detect. "What does it say?" "That's the problem. It's not in any standard barcode format we recognize, but our cryptography team thinks it might be coordinates." "Coordinates to what?" Before Torres could answer, Director Walsh returned to the table, his face grim. "The ground stop is in effect, but we have a problem. Air traffic control just reported that an unregistered aircraft took off from a private airstrip near Raleigh 15 minutes ago. The plane isn't responding to radio contact and isn't showing up properly on radar. Sarah's stomach dropped. It's him, isn't it? We have to assume so. The aircraft appears to be heading toward Charlotte Douglas International Airport. But there are no commercial flights in the air, Jim pointed out. No, Walsh agreed grimly. But there are still planes on the ground. Hundreds of them, fully fueled. Some with passengers already boarded and waiting for the all-clear. Sarah realized the horrible truth. He doesn't need a plane to take off. He needs a plane to crash, and an airport full of grounded aircraft would be a target-rich environment, Walsh finished. Dr. Mitchell, I need you to think. Did Voss give you any clues about where he might be operating from? Any indication of his base of operations? Sarah tried to remember every detail of their encounter in the archive. He mentioned that he'd been preparing for decades. The equipment in the archive, it looked like it had been there for a while, hidden behind those storage boxes. We've already secured that area, Torres said, but our technical team found something interesting. The equipment appears to be connected to a larger network through fiber optic cables that run deeper into the university's basement levels. There are old tunnels under Duke, Sarah said, sudden understanding dawning on her. Built in the 1920s for utility access, they connect most of the major buildings on campus. Walsh was already on his radio again. I need a full tactical team in those tunnels now, and get me a direct line to Charlotte Airport security. As the agents coordinated their response, Sarah found herself studying the barcode data on Torres's tablet. Something about the pattern was familiar, tickling at the edge of her memory. Jim, look at this barcode sequence. Doesn't it remind you of something? Jim examined the tablet. It looks almost like coordinates, but not longitude and latitude, more like grid references, Sarah finished, like the system used by the National Archives for cataloging locations of historical sites. She grabbed Torres's tablet and began cross-referencing the barcode sequence with the National Archives database. After several tense minutes, a result appeared on the screen. Wright Brothers National Memorial, she read aloud. Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Kill, Devil Hills. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. He's not operating from Duke, Sarah said slowly. That was just a message delivery system. His real base is at Kitty Hawk, where it all began. Director Walsh was already moving toward the door. Torres, get a helicopter ready. We're going to North Carolina. Wait, Sarah called after him. You're going to need me. I'm the only one who's spoken to him, who understands what he's trying to do. Absolutely not. This is a federal operation now. Director Walsh, Sarah said firmly, Voss specifically chose me as a witness. He wanted me to find those photographs, to uncover his plan. I don't think that was random. I think I'm part of this somehow, whether I want to be or not. Walsh studied her for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. Fine, but you follow orders and stay back when we make contact. As they prepared to leave for the helicopter, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. Voss had been planning this for 50 years, and she doubted he'd simply overlooked the possibility that the authorities might trace his location. Her phone buzzed one more time. Kitty Hawk, where it all began and where it will all end. Come alone, Dr. Mitchell, or watch the skies burn. 8 hours remaining. HV. Sarah looked up to see Director Walsh reading the message over her shoulder. Change of plans, he said grimly. We're not just going to Kitty Hawk to stop him. We're going to end this one way or another. As they headed toward the helicopter, Sarah realized that she was about to return to the birthplace of aviation, possibly to witness its destruction. The FBI helicopter cut through the morning sky over eastern North Carolina, its rotors beating a steady rhythm as they approached the Outer Banks. Sarah pressed her face to the window, watching the landscape below transform from inland forests to the flat, wind-swept terrain where aviation history had been born. Director Walsh sat across from her, speaking urgently into his headset as he coordinated with multiple agencies. Agent Torres was reviewing tactical plans with the strike team, while Jim sat quietly beside Sarah, his face pale with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Charlotte Airport reports that the unidentified aircraft has disappeared from radar, Walsh announced, pulling off his headset. It was last seen heading southeast, directly toward our location. How long until we reach Kitty Hawk? Sarah asked. 15 minutes. But Dr. Mitchell, I need you to understand something. If this Heinrich Voss really possesses the capabilities you've described, we may be walking into a situation unlike anything any of us have encountered before. Sarah nodded, her stomach churning with anxiety. Through the helicopter's window, She could see the Wright Brothers National Memorial in the distance, the tall granite monument marking the spot where human flight had begun. But today, it might witness something far more sinister. "There," Agent Torres called out, pointing toward the memorial grounds. "Movement near the visitor center." Sarah squinted at the area below. Several black vehicles were parked near the monument, and she could see figures in tactical gear taking positions around the perimeter. But what caught her attention was something else entirely, a strange shimmer in the air near the actual site where the Wright flyer had first taken off, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. "Do you see that distortion?" she asked, pointing it out to the others. Walsh studied the area through binoculars. "Whatever it is, it wasn't there when our advance team arrived an hour ago. Torres, get us down now." The helicopter touched down in the visitor center parking lot, where they were met by a team of federal agents, led by a stern-faced woman who introduced herself as Special Agent Parker. "Situation report," Walsh demanded as they walked briskly toward the memorial. "We've established a perimeter around the monument, but we have a problem," Parker said. "Our equipment is malfunctioning the closer we get to the flight site. Radio communications are intermittent, and several agents have reported severe disorientation when they approach the area." "What kind of disorientation?" "Memory gaps, temporal confusion. One agent swore he saw the Wright brothers' original flight happening right in front of him. Another claimed he witnessed a modern jetliner crash in the same spot." Sarah exchanged a worried glance with Jim. "The temporal energy Voss mentioned. It's affecting the area around the monument." They crested a small hill and got their first clear view of the Wright brothers' monument. The scene was both familiar and deeply wrong. The memorial stood exactly as Sarah remembered from previous visits, but the air around the base of the monument rippled and wavered like water. And there, standing calmly in the center of the distortion, was Heinrich Voss. He had changed since their encounter in the archive. His clothing now appeared to shift and blur between different time periods, sometimes the modern suit he'd worn before, sometimes early 20th century attire, occasionally what looked like futuristic garments that didn't quite seem real. "Dr. Mitchell," his voice carried clearly across the distance, despite the wind and the helicopter noise. "I'm glad you could make it, and you brought friends." Walsh raised a megaphone. "Dr. Voss, this is Director Walsh, Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're surrounded. Shut down whatever equipment you're using and surrender immediately." Voss laughed, a sound that seemed to echo from multiple time periods simultaneously. "Director Walsh, I've been expecting you for 50 years. Literally. I've seen this moment played out dozens of times across different timelines." "What do you want?" Walsh called back. "I want Dr. Mitchell to understand what she's really stumbled into. This isn't just about preventing aviation disasters, Director. This is about saving humanity from its own inevitable self-destruction." Voss raised his wrist, and the device there projected a holographic display into the air, a complex timeline showing branching possibilities stretching into the future. "In every timeline where I don't succeed today, humanity faces extinction within the next century. Climate collapse, nuclear war, pandemic, the specific cause varies, but the result is always the same: total annihilation." Sarah found herself taking a step forward, despite the agents trying to hold her back. "And you think murdering innocent people will change that? I think that creating a stable temporal rift will allow me to send critical information back through time. Warnings about future disasters, technological advances, scientific breakthroughs, everything humanity needs to avoid its darkest timeline." The distortion around Voss began to intensify, and Sarah could swear she saw glimpses of other time periods flickering in and out of existence. The Wright brothers' original flight, early aviation experiments, modern jets, and things that looked like they belonged in the distant future. "The aviation disasters you've documented," she called out, "they're not just sources of temporal energy, are they? They're anchors, specific points in time where the timeline is most vulnerable to manipulation." "Very good, Dr. Mitchell. You understand more than your FBI friends do." Agent Torres was speaking urgently into her radio. "Sir, we're getting reports of multiple aircraft appearing and disappearing on radar all across the eastern seaboard. It's like the entire aviation timeline is destabilizing." "Because it is," Voss confirmed. "Every aviation disaster I've documented is beginning to happen simultaneously across all timelines. The temporal stress is building toward the critical moment when I can create a permanent rift." Walsh turned to Sarah desperately. "Can we stop this?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but I think I'm beginning to understand why he specifically wanted me here." Jim, remember what you said about the barcode coordinates in the photographs? They didn't just point to this location, they pointed to me. She looked at Voss across the wavering air. I'm not just a witness, am I? I'm part of the process somehow. You're the key, Dr. Mitchell. Your expertise in historical photography, your ability to authenticate the impossible. You're the one person who could legitimately document what happens here today. And documentation, as you've learned, is how information travels through time. The temporal distortion suddenly expanded, engulfing the entire monument area. Sarah felt a sickening sensation as reality seemed to shift around her, showing her glimpses of aviation history playing out simultaneously. The Wright Flyer lifting off, World War I dogfights, commercial jets, space shuttles, and crashes from across the decades, all occupying the same space and time. Choose, Dr. Mitchell, Voss called out, his voice now coming from multiple directions at once. Document my success and help me save humanity, or watch as every aviation disaster in history happens at once, right here, right now. As if summoned by his words, Sarah heard the roar of engines overhead. Looking up, she saw something that made her blood freeze. Dozens of aircraft from different eras filling the sky above Kitty Hawk, all heading directly toward the ground in a massive, impossible collision course. The final phase of Project Kronos had begun. The sky above Kitty Hawk had become a nightmare of colliding timelines. Sarah watched in horror as aircraft from throughout aviation history materialized and vanished in the air above the Wright Brothers Memorial. The original Wright Flyer flickered in and out of existence, alongside Spirit of St. Louis, World War II fighters, modern commercial jets, and spacecraft that looked like they belonged centuries in the future. "Everyone down," Director Walsh shouted as debris from impossible crashes began raining around them. But the debris wasn't quite real. Pieces of metal and burning fuel that flickered between solid and translucent, existing in multiple timelines simultaneously. Sarah found herself standing in the center of the temporal storm, oddly protected by the same distortion that was causing the chaos. Around her, she could see the monument grounds as they existed across different time periods, sometimes the modern memorial, sometimes the empty dunes of 1903, sometimes structures that didn't yet exist. "This is what happens when you try to force change through violence," she called out to Voss, who stood at the epicenter of the distortion. "You're not saving timelines, you're destroying them all." "Temporary chaos for permanent salvation," Voss replied, his form shifting between different ages as the temporal fields around him fluctuated. "Every great breakthrough requires sacrifice." Agent Torres was shouting into her radio, trying to coordinate with forces that couldn't understand what they were seeing. "All units, we have... I don't know how to describe this. Multiple aircraft incidents occurring simultaneously at the same location, but they're not physically there." Jim grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her attention away from the aerial chaos. "Look at the ground," he said urgently. Sarah looked down and gasped. The earth around the monument was covered with ghostly impressions of crash sites from across aviation history, scorch marks from the Hindenburg disaster, debris patterns from TWA Flight 800, the impact crater from 9/11, and dozens of other tragedies all occupying the same space. He's pulling the psychic trauma from every aviation disaster in history into this one location, she realized. The temporal energy isn't just coming from one future crash, it's coming from all of them, simultaneously. "And look at this," Jim said, pointing to his phone. The device was displaying impossible readings. The GPS showed their location as changing constantly, cycling through coordinates from around the world. "We're not just at Kitty Hawk anymore. We're at every crash site at once." The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. That's how he's going to create the permanent rift. He's not just using the energy from one disaster. He's using the accumulated trauma from every aviation tragedy in history. Voss raised his arms, and the wristband on his arm projected a massive holographic display showing the branching timelines of human history. "Watch, Dr. Mitchell, as I reshape the future itself." The display showed timeline after timeline where humanity faced extinction, climate disasters, wars, pandemics, technological catastrophes. But then new branches began appearing, alternate histories where these disasters were avoided through advanced knowledge. "The information I'll send back will prevent World War I, Voss explained, his voice carrying across the temporal storm. "The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand will fail because security forces will have advance warning. The Spanish flu pandemic will be contained Because medical professionals will know exactly what's coming. And the Wright Brothers flight? Sarah asked. Will never happen. Aviation will be delayed by decades, preventing both its greatest triumphs and its most terrible disasters. Sarah felt the terrible logic of his plan. By preventing the birth of aviation, Voss would eliminate not just the disasters associated with flight, but the technological progression that led to many of humanity's other catastrophes. But you'll also eliminate all the positive aspects, she argued. Medical evacuations, disaster relief, space exploration, global communication, acceptable losses, Voss said coldly. A world without flight will develop other solutions, safer ones. The temporal distortion suddenly intensified, and Sarah found herself experiencing flashes of the alternate timelines Voss was creating. She saw a world where the Wright brothers failed, where aviation remained a dream, where 2 world wars were avoided, but other potentially worse conflicts took their place. "It doesn't work," she shouted over the sound of engines from across time. "I can see the other timelines. Humanity finds other ways to destroy itself. Nuclear weapons developed faster without aviation to distract from ground-based research. Biological warfare becomes the preferred method of mass destruction. Then I'll send back more information, create more changes," Voss replied. "I have eternity to perfect the timeline." "No, you don't," Jim called out, pointing at Voss's wristband. "Look at your device." Sarah could see what Jim had noticed. The temporal display on Voss's wrist was showing error messages, warnings about timeline instability and paradox cascade failure. "You're trying to change too much at once," Sarah realized. The temporal framework can't handle the strain of rewriting a century of history simultaneously. Around them, the ghostly crashes were becoming more solid, more real. The Wright brothers' memorial was flickering between existence and non-existence, the monument itself becoming unstable as its historical foundation was undermined. "Warning," an electronic voice announced from Voss's equipment. "Temporal cascade failure imminent. Timeline collapse in T-3 minutes." "What does that mean?" Director Walsh shouted from the edge of the distortion field. "It means he's not going to save humanity," Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. "He's going to erase it entirely. If the timeline collapses completely, nothing that ever happened will have happened." Voss's confident expression was finally cracking. "No, this is just a calibration issue. I can adjust the parameters." "You can't control this," Sarah said, stepping toward him through the temporal storm. "You're dealing with forces beyond human comprehension. The timeline isn't a machine you can repair. It's a living system, and you're killing it." The aircraft overhead were beginning to merge together, creating impossible hybrid crashes that defied physics and causality. The Wright Flyer was colliding with jumbo jets while simultaneously taking off successfully. The Hindenburg was both exploding and landing safely at the same moment. "T-2 minutes to cascade failure," the electronic voice announced. Sarah realized she had one chance to stop this. Voss had said she was the key, the one who could document what happened here. But documentation wasn't just about recording events, it was about preserving truth. "Heinrich," she said, using his first name for the first time, "look around you. Really look. This isn't salvation, it's madness. You're not preserving humanity's future. You're destroying its past, present, and future all at once." For the first time since this nightmare began, Voss seemed to truly see what his experiment had created. The expression on his face shifted from confidence to horror as he witnessed the complete breakdown of causality around the memorial. "I was trying to save them," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the temporal storm. "I know," Sarah said gently, reaching out to him, "but some things can't be saved through violence, even violence against time itself. T-1 minute to cascade failure. Timeline collapse imminent." Sarah looked at the device on Voss's wrist, then at her own hands. She had spent her career documenting history, preserving the truth of past events. Maybe it was time to preserve the truth of the present. "Give me the device, Heinrich. Let me document this properly. Let me make sure that what happens here today is remembered correctly, without paradox or impossibility." Voss looked at her with eyes that held 50 years of desperate hope and growing despair. Around them, the temporal storm reached its crescendo, threatening to tear apart the very fabric of reality itself. 30 seconds to cascade failure. Everything Sarah knew about history, about truth, about the importance of accurate documentation, came together in this moment. She held out her hand to Heinrich Voss, offering him one last chance at redemption and offering humanity one last chance at survival. 15 seconds to cascade failure. the electronic voice announced, its tone growing more urgent with each word. Heinrich Voss stared at Sarah's outstretched hand, his face a mask of anguish and indecision. Around them, the temporal storm raged at its peak intensity. The Wright Brothers memorial flickered between existing and never having been built, while overhead, impossible aerial disasters played out in an endless loop of creation and destruction. "Sarah," Jim shouted from the edge of the distortion field, "whatever you're going to do, do it now. 10 seconds to cascade failure." Voss looked up at the chaos he had created, then back at Sarah. "If I give you the device, how do I know you won't just destroy everything I've worked for?" "Because I'm not going to destroy it," Sarah said, her voice calm despite the temporal hurricane surrounding them. "I'm going to document it properly, the way it should have been documented from the beginning. 5 seconds to cascade failure." Voss's hand moved toward the device on his wrist, then hesitated. "The timelines I've seen, humanity's extinction, 4 seconds. Are possibilities, not certainties," Sarah finished. "Humanity has to earn its survival, not have it imposed through temporal manipulation." 3 seconds. Voss's fingers touched the clasp of his wristband. "I wanted to be their savior." 2 seconds. "You can still save them," Sarah said, "by letting them save themselves." 1 second. Voss tore the device from his wrist and pressed it into Sarah's hands. "Timeline collapse abort." The announcement cut off abruptly as Sarah's fingers closed around the temporal device. Immediately she felt a shock of awareness. She could see the branching possibilities of time stretching out before her like an infinite web. Every choice, every moment, every consequence laid out in crystalline clarity. The temporal storm around them began to subside, but slowly, like a hurricane gradually losing its power. The ghostly aircraft overhead flickered and faded, returning to their proper places in history. The crash sites scattered across the memorial grounds dissolved back into normal grass and sand. But Sarah could feel the device's power coursing through her consciousness. The temptation to use it, to send back warnings about future disasters, to prevent the tragedies she had studied throughout her career, it was almost overwhelming. "Sarah," Jim's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What's happening to you?" She looked down at her hands and saw that they were beginning to shimmer with the same temporal distortion that had surrounded Voss. The device was integrating with her nervous system, offering her the same godlike power over time that had driven Heinrich Voss to madness. Through the device's interface, she could see the specific disasters Voss had been trying to prevent. Flight 800 exploding over Long Island, the planes striking the World Trade Center, Challenger breaking apart in the clear Florida sky, hundreds of other tragedies that had claimed thousands of lives. All she had to do was send back a single warning, and she could save them all. "No," she said aloud, struggling against the device's influence. "This isn't how history works. This isn't how truth works." The device showed her more. Climate disasters that could be prevented with advance warning, pandemics that could be contained, wars that could be avoided. The weight of all that potential salvation pressed against her mind. "Dr. Mitchell," Director Walsh's voice called from the edge of the memorial grounds, "we need you to step away from the device." But Sarah couldn't step away. The temporal interface was showing her something else now. The reason Voss had failed. Every change he had attempted to make had created ripple effects, unintended consequences that often resulted in even greater disasters. Preventing World War I led to a delayed but more devastating global conflict. Stopping the aviation disasters eliminated the safety improvements that followed them, leading to even worse crashes later. Saving lives in one timeline often cost more lives in another. The timeline isn't broken, Sarah realized, speaking to the device as much as to the people around her. It's self-correcting. Humanity learns from its mistakes, grows stronger from its tragedies. That's not a flaw in history, that's its greatest strength. She could feel Voss watching her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're going to destroy it, aren't you? All my work." "No," Sarah said, looking at him with something approaching compassion. "I'm going to complete it, the right way." Instead of using the device to send information backward through time, Sarah began documenting the present moment with perfect accuracy. She recorded the truth of what had happened at Kitty Hawk, Heinrich Voss's misguided attempt to save humanity, the temporal chaos he had created, and most importantly, the choice to step back from the brink of temporal tyranny. The device resisted at first, designed as it was for temporal manipulation rather than mere documentation. But Sarah's decades of experience with historical preservation guided her, and gradually, the machine began to function as she intended, not as a tool for changing the past, but as an instrument for preserving truth. As she worked, the last of the temporal distortions faded away. The Wright Brothers memorial stood solid and real in the morning sunlight, unchanged by Voss's intervention. The timeline had healed itself, stronger for having been tested. "What happens now?" Jim asked, approaching carefully as Sarah finally deactivated the device. "Now we make sure this never happens again," she said, looking at the wristband that had caused so much chaos. "This technology is too dangerous to exist." She handed the device to Director Walsh, who accepted it with obvious relief. "Will destroying it undo what Voss did?" Voss didn't actually change anything, Sarah realized. The disasters he documented were going to happen anyway. The timeline was never really in danger. Only his sanity was. Heinrich Voss had aged visibly during their confrontation, the temporal strain finally catching up with his 50-year displacement from normal time. He looked at Sarah with exhausted gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I lost sight of what I was trying to protect. I became so focused on preventing death that I forgot about preserving life." Sarah nodded, understanding the distinction. The best way to honor the victims of disasters isn't to prevent their deaths. It's to learn from their sacrifice and use that knowledge to protect others. As FBI agents moved in to secure Voss and the temporal device, Sarah found herself looking up at the clear sky above Kitty Hawk. Somewhere up there, commercial aircraft were resuming their normal routes, carrying passengers safely to their destinations. The aviation industry would continue to evolve, to improve, to occasionally fail, and to learn from those failures. It wasn't perfect, but it was human, and perhaps that was enough. The Wright Brothers memorial stood unchanged behind her, a testament to humanity's greatest achievement, not the conquest of time, but the courage to reach toward the future, despite not knowing what it might hold. 3 days after the temporal crisis at Kitty Hawk, Sarah sat in a secure conference room, deep within a government facility outside Washington, D.C. The walls were lined with monitors displaying classified information, and the air hummed with the tension of ongoing investigations. Across from her sat Director Walsh, Agent Torres, and several officials whose names and agencies she hadn't been told. Heinrich Voss was being held in a special containment facility designed for individuals deemed temporally unstable. The doctors weren't entirely sure what 50 years of temporal displacement had done to his physiology, but initial examinations suggested he was aging rapidly as his body attempted to sync with the current timeline. "Dr. Mitchell," Walsh began, sliding a thick folder across the table, "we need to discuss what happens next." Sarah opened the folder and found dozens of photographs dating back to the Civil War, all showing impossible anachronisms similar to what she had discovered in the Wright Brothers images. A Union soldier with what appeared to be a modern GPS device, a Victorian-era railway engineer wearing a digital chronometer, an early automobile pioneer with a smartphone-like device visible in his coat pocket. "These have all been found in government archives over the past 72 hours, Agent Torres explained. "It appears that Voss wasn't the only one who had access to temporal technology. Or," said one of the unnamed officials, "he wasn't working alone." Sarah studied the images with a growing sense of unease. The devices in these historical photographs were different from Voss's wristband, more primitive in some ways, but clearly part of the same technological family. "You think there's been an entire organization operating across time?" she asked. "We think Project Looking Glass never really ended," Walsh replied. "When the Nevada facility was destroyed in 1969, some personnel may have been scattered across different time periods rather than killed. They could have been working toward the same goal as Voss, just using different methods." Sarah turned to a photograph dated 1865, showing Abraham Lincoln in his final days. There, barely visible in the shadow of his famous stovepipe hat, was a small device that looked remarkably similar to a modern hearing aid, but the display was clearly showing a date and time. "April 14th, 1865, she read from the enhanced image. "Ford's Theater, 10:15 p.m. "The exact time and location of his assassination," Torres confirmed, "which suggests that someone had advanced knowledge of the event, but chose not to prevent it. Or couldn't prevent it without causing worse consequences," Sarah said, remembering her experience with the temporal device. "Maybe they learned what Voss never did, that changing history is more dangerous than documenting it." She continued through the folder, finding similar devices in photographs spanning nearly 2 centuries of American history. The Great Chicago Fire, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the sinking of the Titanic, Pearl Harbor, all documented with impossible foreknowledge. The question is, Walsh said, are these other temporal agents still active? And if so, what's their endgame? Before Sarah could respond, the conference room door opened and Jim entered, carrying a laptop and looking excited despite the circumstances. "Sarah, you need to see this," he said, setting up the computer on the table. "I've been analyzing the data from Voss's device before it was destroyed. The temporal signature isn't random. It follows a specific pattern." He pulled up a complex waveform analysis on the screen. "Look at these frequency modulations. They're not just documenting disasters. They're creating a kind of temporal map of traumatic events throughout history." Sarah studied the display, her historian's mind immediately seeing the pattern. They're not random disasters. They're all connected to technological or social inflection points, moments when human civilization took a significant step forward. "Exactly," Jim said. "The Wright Brothers' flight, Lincoln's assassination during Reconstruction, the Chicago fire that led to modern urban planning, Pearl Harbor bringing America into World War II, they're documenting the events that shaped the modern world," Sarah finished. "But why?" One of the unnamed officials leaned forward. "Dr. Mitchell, we have reason to believe that the temporal agents aren't trying to change history. They're trying to preserve it. Preserve it from what? From other temporal manipulators. Think about it. If technology exists to change the past, then multiple groups could be trying to alter events for their own purposes. The agents in these photographs might be guardians, ensuring that history unfolds as it's supposed to." Sarah felt a chill as she realized the implications. "You're saying there's been a temporal war going on throughout history, and we never knew it?" "We're saying it's possible," Walsh replied carefully. "And if so, then Voss may have been more than just a rogue scientist. He may have been a casualty of that war." Jim pulled up another analysis on his laptop. "There's something else. The temporal device we recovered from Voss. It's not the same technology as the devices in these historical photographs. It's more advanced but also more unstable, like someone took the original design and tried to weaponize it. So there are at least two factions," Sarah said, the picture becoming clearer. "The guardians who document history to preserve it, and others who want to change it." "And Voss was recruited by the latter group," Torres added. "His brilliant work in temporal mechanics made him a valuable asset, but his humanitarian impulses made him unreliable. That's why they sent him back to 1969, to get him out of the way, until he figured out how to return to the present and complete his mission," Walsh concluded. Sarah looked back at the folder of impossible photographs, seeing them now not as evidence of temporal manipulation, but as proof of temporal protection. Each anachronistic device was a guardian's tool, documenting history to ensure it remained unchanged. "If this is true," she said slowly, "then there are still temporal agents operating in our time period, and they may have been watching us throughout this entire crisis." As if summoned by her words, the lights in the conference room flickered once. When they steadied, there was a new photograph lying on the table, one that hadn't been there moments before. It showed Sarah herself, sitting in the very chair she now occupied, in the very room where they were meeting. But the timestamp on a device clearly visible on her wrist showed a date 3 days in the future, and the accompanying text read, "Temporal war escalation imminent. Phase 4. Initiated. Historians recruited." Sarah looked down at her own wrist, where she had been unconsciously rubbing the spot where Voss's device had briefly attached to her nervous system. The skin there was slightly discolored, as if stained by temporal energy. "I think," she said quietly, "we're about to become more involved in this than any of us realized." Outside the conference room windows, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the government complex, but Sarah could swear that some of those shadows were moving independently, as if cast by people who existed in slightly different time periods. The temporal war, it seemed, was far from over, and somehow she had just been drafted. The discoloration on Sarah's wrist had grown darker overnight, spreading up her arm like a network of temporal veins. She sat in her Duke University office, staring at the phenomenon, while Jim paced nervously behind her. They had returned from Washington with more questions than answers, and the mysterious photograph showing Sarah's future involvement in Phase 4 had left them both on edge. "It doesn't hurt," Sarah said, tracing the patterns with her finger. "If anything, it feels aware, like there's information flowing through it." "Information about what?" Jim asked, though his expression suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Before Sarah could answer, her office door opened without a knock. A woman entered, elderly, dignified, wearing a 1940s-style dress that looked authentic rather than vintage. Most unnervingly, she wore a device on her wrist identical to those Sarah had seen in the historical photographs. "Dr. Mitchell," the woman said with a slight British accent. "My name is Margaret Thornfield. I believe it's time we met properly." Jim stepped protectively in front of Sarah. "How did you get past university security?" Margaret smiled kindly. "Security systems are less effective when one can enter a building 30 years before they're installed. Please, sit down, both of you. We have much to discuss and very little time." Despite every instinct telling her to call for help, Sarah found herself intrigued. "You're one of the temporal guardians, aren't you? The ones documenting history to preserve it." "I prefer the term Chronos Conservancy," Margaret replied, settling into a chair with the grace of someone from a more elegant era. "And yes, we have been protecting the timeline for nearly a century now." She gestured to her wrist device. "This technology was originally developed by your government in the 1960s, as you've discovered. But when Project Looking Glass failed, those of us who survived realized that temporal manipulation technology would inevitably be rediscovered. We made a choice to become its guardians rather than its exploiters. By traveling through history and documenting disasters before they happen," Sarah said. "By ensuring that history unfolds as it should. Every significant event in human development has faced temporal threats, attempts by various factions to alter the outcome for their own benefit. The Wright Brothers flight, for instance, has been targeted 17 times by groups trying to prevent the development of aviation." Jim sat down heavily. 17 times? The most recent was Heinrich Voss's attempt. But there have been others. Industrialists trying to delay flight to protect railroad investments, military leaders trying to accelerate it for warfare advantage, environmental groups trying to prevent the carbon emissions that would follow. Each time we've intervened to preserve the original timeline. Sarah looked at the spreading patterns on her arm. "And now you want to recruit me." "The temporal war is escalating," Margaret confirmed. "Our opponents have developed new technologies, more aggressive methods. They're no longer content with subtle changes. They want to completely rewrite human history." She activated her wrist device, and a holographic display appeared showing a complex timeline with multiple branches. "They call themselves the Revision Syndicate. Their goal is to create what they consider a perfect human civilization, one without war, disease, or disaster." "That doesn't sound evil," Jim said cautiously. "Doesn't it?" Margaret manipulated the display to show the syndicate's proposed changes. They would prevent the Black Death, eliminating the social upheaval that led to the Renaissance. They would stop the American Civil War, leaving slavery intact. They would prevent both world wars, allowing fascist regimes to develop unopposed. Sarah studied the projected timeline with growing horror. The syndicate's perfect world was one of stagnation and oppression, where humanity never faced the challenges that drove it to grow stronger. "Human progress comes from overcoming adversity," Margaret continued. "Remove the adversity, and you remove the progress. The syndicate sees only the pain of historical events. They're blind to their necessity." "And Heinrich Voss was working for them?" "Unwittingly. They recruited him by showing him only the disasters, never the growth that followed. His humanitarian instincts made him the perfect tool for their agenda." Sarah felt the patterns on her arm pulse with warmth. "These markings, they're not just from exposure to temporal energy, are they? They're some kind of interface." Margaret nodded approvingly. "The temporal residue from Voss's device has bonded with your nervous system. It's painful when it happens naturally, but it grants you access to temporal perception. You can see the flow of time, understand the connections between events." "I don't want to be part of a temporal war," Sarah said firmly. "I'm afraid you already are," Margaret replied. "The syndicate knows you stopped Voss. They consider you a threat to their operations. They're going to try to eliminate you, or worse, recruit you by force." As if summoned by her words, the office windows suddenly darkened, though it was still mid-afternoon. Outside, Sarah could see figures moving through what appeared to be a different time period entirely, the Duke campus as it existed decades earlier. "They're here," Margaret said, standing and adjusting her wrist device. "Phase 4 has begun." The office door burst open, and 3 figures entered, wearing modern tactical gear, but carrying weapons that pulsed with temporal energy. Their leader, a woman with cold eyes and military bearing, pointed one of the devices at Sarah. "Dr. Sarah Mitchell," the woman announced. "By order of the Temporal Revision Syndicate, you are to be extracted for reassignment to Timeline 7. Timeline 7? Jim asked. "A reality where the Syndicate has already won," Margaret explained grimly. "Where they've rewritten history to their specifications. They want to show Dr. Mitchell their perfect world, to convince her to join them." The Syndicate leader smiled coldly. "Dr. Mitchell has unique talents in historical documentation. In Timeline 7, she will help us catalogue the improvements we've made to human civilization." Sarah felt the temporal patterns on her arm, responding to the devices the Syndicate agents carried. She could suddenly see the branching possibilities around this moment, dozens of potential outcomes depending on the choices made in the next few seconds. "I can see it," she whispered to Margaret. "The timelines. The possibilities." "Then you understand what's at stake," Margaret replied, her own device charging with energy. "Choose carefully, Dr. Mitchell. The future of authentic human history depends on what happens next." The Syndicate agents raised their weapons, ready to forcibly transport Sarah to their alternate timeline. Margaret prepared to defend her, her conservation device glowing with protective energy. Jim stood frozen between them, caught in forces beyond his comprehension, and Sarah, feeling the weight of temporal perception flowing through her consciousness, realized that this moment would determine not just her fate, but the fate of every historical event that had ever happened or ever would happen. The temporal war had come to Duke University, and she was at the center of it. The world dissolved around Sarah in a cascade of temporal energy, reality blurring and reshaping itself as she was pulled through the dimensional barrier between timelines. When the disorientation cleared, she found herself standing in what appeared to be her own office at Duke University, but everything was subtly wrong. The books on her shelves were different, focusing on subjects like harmonious development theory and conflict-free historical progression. The window showed a campus that looked like a cross between Duke and a futuristic utopia, gleaming buildings connected by enclosed walkways, students dressed in uniform gray clothing, and no visible diversity in architecture or activity. "Welcome to Timeline 7, Dr. Mitchell," the Syndicate leader said, removing her tactical helmet to reveal short-cropped blonde hair and pale blue eyes. "I'm Commander Alexandra Kane. This is what human civilization looks like when properly guided." Sarah looked around the sterile perfection with growing unease. "Where are Jim and Margaret?" "Safe in your original timeline for now. We wanted you to see our achievements without distraction." Through the window, Sarah could see students moving across the campus in orderly groups, their faces pleasant but expressionless. There were no protests, no heated debates, no signs of the intellectual ferment that she associated with university life. "Your timeline's Duke University is chaotic," Commander Kane continued, settling behind a desk that was identical to Sarah's, but made of some gleaming material she didn't recognize. "Students waste energy on conflicts. Professors argue endlessly about interpretations. Research proceeds in inefficient directions. Here we've eliminated such waste." Sarah examined the books more closely. The history texts were uniformly positive, describing centuries of steady progress without war, revolution, or social upheaval. How? By preventing the traumatic events that led to conflict. No Black Death meant no social upheaval, no need for the Renaissance. No American Revolution meant no violent precedent for other nations. No Industrial Revolution meant no exploitation of workers or environmental damage, but also no technological advancement, no social progress, no human growth, Sarah countered. Kane activated a wall display showing global statistics. "Observe our achievements. 0 warfare for 3 centuries, 0 poverty, 0 crime, 0 preventable disease. Every citizen has a role. Every role serves the greater good." The statistics were impressive, but something about them felt hollow to Sarah. "What about innovation? Art? Individual achievement?" "Innovation proceeds according to careful planning. Art serves social harmony. Individual achievement is measured by contribution to collective goals." Kane's tone suggested these were self-evidently positive things. Sarah walked to the window and studied the scene below more carefully. The students moved in perfect synchronization, their conversations limited to functional exchanges. There was no laughter, no spontaneous interaction, no signs of the messy vitality that defined human nature. "They look like robots," she said quietly. "They look peaceful," Kane corrected. "Your timeline's humans are driven by conflict, competition, and chaos. Ours have transcended such primitive impulses." Primitive impulses that drive creativity, love, and growth, Sarah argued. Kane gestured to another display, showing technological achievements. We have achieved technological wonders your timeline cannot imagine. Fusion power, space colonization, genetic perfection, extended lifespans, all without the destructive competition that characterizes your history. Sarah examined the technological displays with her historian's eye. The innovations were impressive but seemed strangely sterile. Fusion reactors that provided unlimited clean energy, but no mention of who had developed them or why. Space colonies that housed millions, but no indication of exploration or discovery. Genetic treatments that eliminated disease, but also eliminated genetic diversity. Who makes the decisions in this world? She asked. The Optimization Council, representatives selected based on their ability to make rational choices for the collective good. And who selects the representatives? Kane hesitated for the first time. The selection process is optimized for efficiency. Sarah felt the temporal patterns on her arm responding to something in the environment. She was beginning to perceive the underlying structure of this timeline, and what she saw made her stomach turn. There's no free will here, is there? She said. Everyone's path is predetermined, optimized by some kind of algorithm. Free will is an illusion that causes suffering, Kane replied, but her voice lacked conviction. Here people are free from the burden of difficult choices. They're free from the possibility of growth, of love, of meaning. Sarah turned away from the window, unable to continue watching the hollow perfection below. This isn't paradise, Commander. This is a prison disguised as utopia. Kane's expression hardened. Your timeline is heading toward destruction. Climate collapse, nuclear war, pandemic disease. We've seen the projections. Within 50 years, your chaotic approach to civilization will result in human extinction. Maybe. Or maybe humanity will find a way to overcome those challenges, the same way it's overcome every other obstacle in its history, through struggle, through conflict, through the messy process of learning from mistakes. And if you're wrong, if your precious chaos leads to the death of billions? Sarah looked at her arm, where the temporal patterns were now glowing faintly. Through them she could perceive the true nature of Timeline 7's creation. The Syndicate hadn't just prevented disasters, they had systematically eliminated every event that contributed to human development. I can see what you did, she said, her voice filled with horror. You didn't just prevent wars and disasters. You prevented the Renaissance by stopping the plague, but you also prevented the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the development of human rights. You created a world of eternal medieval stagnation, dressed up as progress. We created stability. You created death, not physical death, but spiritual death, the death of everything that makes humans more than just biological machines. Kane stood abruptly, her patience clearly exhausted. Enough. You'll remain here until you understand the superiority of our approach. Your skills as a historian will be useful in documenting our achievements. And if I refuse, then you'll be optimized for cooperation, just like everyone else. The threat was clear. Sarah would be altered. Her personality adjusted to fit the Syndicate's vision of proper behavior. She thought of Margaret and Jim back in the real timeline, probably facing Syndicate agents even now. I want to see more of your perfect world, Sarah said, an idea beginning to form. If you want me to document it properly, I need to understand it completely. Kane looked suspicious but nodded. Very well. But you'll be escorted at all times. As Kane prepared to show her more of Timeline 7's hollow achievements, Sarah quietly focused on the temporal patterns flowing through her consciousness. Margaret had said she could perceive the flow of time, understand the connections between events. Maybe it was time to test whether she could also influence them. The temporal war was far from over, and Sarah was beginning to understand that the battle for authentic human history would require more than just documentation. It would require action that could reshape the very foundations of reality itself. Sarah spent 3 hours touring Timeline 7's version of human civilization, and with each passing moment, her horror deepened. Cities where every building was identical, designed for optimal function rather than beauty or expression. Libraries containing only approved texts that supported the Optimization Council's vision. Art galleries filled with pleasant, meaningless works that offended no one and inspired nothing. But it was the people that truly broke her heart. They were healthy, well-fed, and utterly empty. Conversations followed predictable patterns. Relationships were assigned based on compatibility algorithms, and children were raised in communal facilities to prevent the inefficiency of family bonds. "This is what happens when you remove human struggle," Sarah told Commander Kane, as they stood in a park where people sat in perfect silence, contemplating nothing. "You don't eliminate suffering, you eliminate the capacity to feel anything meaningful at all." Kane's response was interrupted by an urgent communication through her temporal device. Her face darkened as she listened. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "Your friend, Dr. Rodriguez, and the Kronos Conservancy agent have escaped our containment and are attempting to destabilize our temporal anchor points," Kane said grimly. "They're trying to collapse Timeline 7. Sarah felt a surge of hope, mixed with terror. If Jim and Margaret succeeded, everyone in Timeline 7 would cease to exist, including millions of people who, despite their hollow existence, were still human lives. "You can't just erase an entire timeline," Sarah protested. "Your friends disagree. They believe that preserving your chaotic original timeline justifies destroying our peaceful one." Kane activated her wrist device, and suddenly Sarah could see the temporal battle playing out across multiple dimensions. In the real timeline, Margaret and Jim were using Kronos Conservancy technology to attack the quantum foundations that kept Timeline 7 stable. But the Syndicate was fighting back, trying to expand their altered reality to replace the original timeline entirely. "If they succeed in destroying Timeline 7, billions of people die," Kane said. "If we succeed in expanding it, your original timeline ceases to exist. Either way, one version of humanity is annihilated." Sarah watched the temporal war escalating, understanding finally why she had been brought here. "So you want me to choose, don't you? To decide which timeline deserves to survive. Your perception of temporal connections gives you a unique perspective. You can see the consequences of both choices." Through the patterns flowing through her consciousness, Sarah could indeed see the branching possibilities. If Timeline 7 was destroyed, humanity would return to its chaotic but vibrant development path, including all the disasters and tragedies that came with it. If Timeline 7 expanded, humanity would achieve perfect stability at the cost of everything that made life worth living. But she could see something else. A third possibility that neither side had considered. "You're both wrong," Sarah said, focusing all her newfound temporal perception on the quantum structures around them. "The choice isn't between chaos and order, between suffering and emptiness. The choice is between learning from history and being enslaved by it." She reached out through the temporal field, not trying to destroy Timeline 7 or preserve it, but to merge the timelines in a way that preserved the best of both. It was incredibly dangerous, the kind of temporal manipulation that could unravel reality itself. But Sarah realized she had one advantage that neither the Syndicate nor the Conservancy possessed. She was a historian. Her entire career had been about understanding how events connected, how the past influenced the present, how truth emerged from the careful analysis of evidence. And the truth she had discovered was that both timelines were incomplete. Timeline 7 had eliminated human growth through struggle, but it had also eliminated the capacity for joy, love, and creativity. The original timeline preserved human potential, but at the cost of unnecessary suffering and environmental destruction. Sarah began to weave a new possibility between them, a timeline where humanity learned from its disasters without being prevented from experiencing them, where the knowledge gained from suffering was used to reduce future suffering without eliminating the growth that came from overcoming challenges. "What are you doing?" Kane demanded, her own temporal device showing impossible readings. "I'm doing what historians do," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the enormous strain of reshaping reality itself. "I'm preserving the truth, all of it." Through her consciousness, she reached across the dimensional barrier to the original timeline, connecting with Margaret and Jim. She felt their surprise as they realized what she was attempting, then their understanding as they saw the third path she was creating. Together, the three of them began to weave a new timeline, one that incorporated the hard-won lessons of Timeline 7's peace without sacrificing the chaotic vitality of human nature. A world where the Wright brothers still made their first flight, but where the aviation disasters that followed led more quickly to safety improvements, where wars still occurred but were resolved more efficiently through better diplomacy, where diseases still struck but were met with prepared responses based on historical knowledge. "You're creating a paradox," Kane warned, her voice filled with panic as she felt Timeline 7 beginning to merge with something larger and more complex. "I'm creating synthesis," Sarah corrected. "History isn't about choosing between order and chaos. It's about finding the balance between them." The temporal storm that erupted around them was unlike anything that had occurred at Kitty Hawk. Reality itself seemed to flex and bend as three different versions of human history collapsed into a single, more complete timeline. Sarah felt the patterns in her arm burning as they channeled forces beyond human comprehension, but she held on, guided by her historian's instinct for truth. When the storm finally subsided, Sarah found herself back in her real office at Duke University, but it was subtly different. The books on her shelves now included texts on applied historical analysis and temporal ethics. Outside her window, the campus showed signs of both vibrant intellectual life and thoughtful organization. Jim and Margaret were there, looking exhausted but relieved. Commander Kane was also present, but her expression had changed from cold calculation to something approaching wonder. "What happened?" Jim asked. "We created a better timeline," Sarah said, examining her arm. The temporal patterns were fading, but they had left permanent marks, scars that would remind her forever of the responsibility that came with the power to reshape history. Margaret consulted her wrist device, which now showed a timeline far more complex than the simple linear progression they had been fighting to preserve. The new timeline incorporates elements from all possible histories. Humanity will still face challenges, still make mistakes, but it will do so with greater wisdom. "And the Syndicate?" Sarah asked, looking at Kane. "We'll need to reconsider our methods," Kane admitted. "If this synthesis timeline proves stable, it may represent a better path than either pure order or pure chaos." Sarah walked to her window and looked out at the campus. Students were engaged in animated discussions about their studies, but there were also signs of more thoughtful organization, better coordination between departments, more efficient use of resources, clearer communication about important issues. "It's not perfect," she said. "Humanity will still face disasters, still make tragic mistakes, but now we'll face them with better preparation, and we'll learn from them more effectively." Jim joined her at the window. "What happens to us now? Do we go back to our normal lives?" Sarah touched the fading temporal scars on her arm. "I don't think our lives will ever be entirely normal again. We've seen what happens when people try to control history instead of learning from it. We'll need to watch for others who might try to repeat those mistakes." Margaret nodded approvingly. "The Kronos Conservancy will need historians who understand the true complexity of temporal ethics, people who can preserve history without trying to perfect it." As the sun set over the Duke campus, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had begun with a photograph of the Wright brothers. She had started as a simple historian, documenting the past for future generations. Now she was something new, a guardian of temporal truth, committed to preserving history in all its messy, tragic, beautiful complexity. The Wright brothers' memorial still stood at Kitty Hawk, marking humanity's first flight into the unknown. And thanks to Sarah's intervention, it would continue to stand as a symbol of human courage, the willingness to reach toward the future, despite not knowing what challenges it might hold. History, she had learned, was not about avoiding disasters or creating perfect outcomes. It was about growing stronger through adversity, learning from mistakes, and never losing the courage to reach for something better. And in that truth, she had found something worth preserving across all possible timelines,